Exercise interventions to reduce obesity and associated diseases in overweight youth. As we've been discussing in class, we know that children do not meet current physical activity recommendations. And 50 to 65% of kids actually exercise less than 2 days a week. Around less than 30% exercise less than 3 to 5 days a week, and only 20% exercise 6 to 7 days. And you can see that also Hispanic and African American children are a little bit more sedentary or less active. Children in the U.S. also watch significantly more TV. We see that there's a large portion of kids that watch over 4 hours a day, and this prevalence is more heightened in the African American and Hispanic populations. So what is the target to consider when designing an intervention? There are many types of nutrition and physical activity interventions which target increasing physical activity and decreasing food intake to really reinstate that energy balance. And that's kind of more the conventional energy balance approach to reducing body weight and fat. And what I'm suggesting here is that possibly we might want to consider alternative targets, looking at ways to not just target weight loss, but also target decreases in metabolic disease risks, looking at ectopic fat or visceral fat, or targeting insulin resistance and decreases in disease risk. There was a famous Cochrane review, and they basically review all of the obesity interventions done out there to date and the success rates. And this was a review of 21 different obesity interventions targeting for youth. And you could basically see the type of intervention and how many of those studies targeted either school setting, community setting, or clinic or research setting. And then on the far right-hand column, you could see what percentage of those studies resulted in reductions in obesity. And so the most successful is done in the community setting as far as the setting of schools. It's also important to consider the population. If you target the child alone, and only 3 studies targeted the child alone, and 0% of them were effective at reducing obesity, whereas 12 targeted the child and parent, and that resulted in a 75% reduction in obesity. 9 of the studies had reductions. Then also the type. Nutrition, exercise, or nutrition plus exercise. And you can see here that 15 studies targeted both nutrition and exercise, and 9 out of these studies resulted in reductions in obesity. Of note, 4 of those studies were school-based. And if you exclude the school-based studies, 87% of those studies actually resulted in reductions in obesity. And then also looking at the age range that you target. A majority of the interventions to date have really targeted the 6 to 12-year-old age range, whereas very few have targeted 12 to 18, the teenage years, and even fewer they don't even have it reported on here, targeted younger children, even infants and babies. So you can see here which components of the interventions have been successful and which ones have been less successful. So let's discuss a little bit about the characteristics of intervention studies that have targeted physical activity. The majority of studies have used a cardiovascular exercise approach. Where they've really just focused on getting the kids to be active and increasing moderate to vigorous physical activity. Some have taken the approach of decreasing sedentary behavior, so they've not focused at all on increasing physical activity, but really about decreasing screen time, whether it be TV or internet time. A few studies in the past decade have really focused on strength training, and even fewer have used the circuit training approach, which includes both cardiovascular and strength training. Location and instructor is also an important component, characteristic to consider. Many happen in the schools, and they rely on teachers, educator, and nurses to lead the classes. Some use community centers, and they rely on staff and community leaders to lead the classes. Some of the ones we've done have used health or research clinics and relied on, hiring staff or educators to come in and lead the classes. The duration and intensity varies, but the majority of the physical activity interventions actually go from 12 to 16 weeks, and they can be anywhere from 1 time a week to 3 times a week, and I've seen anything from 30 minutes at each session to 90 minutes. And then typically after the initial 16 weeks of the weekly lessons, they move more of a monthly or bi-monthly maintenance component to take you to a full year or even 2 years. Now, when we think of the outcomes, the things you want to evaluate in response to the intervention, most people use, weight and height, body mass index or BMI. Some people go a little bit more in depth and look at body composition, and that could be using the different techniques we talked about a couple weeks ago. Skin folds, there's been a couple that use DEXA and even fewer that use MRI. But you also want to look at dietary intake. Even though it's a physical activity intervention, you still want to know what they're intaking. And, you can use records or recalls for this. Then you definitely want to have some sort of measure of physical activity. Or if it's a more of a strength training program, maybe physical fitness. But you can use a variety of the techniques that we talked about as well. Accelerometry, self-report. You can also do fitness testing. And then fewer use things like metabolic measures. Look at the effects of a physical activity intervention on fasting glucose or glucose and insulin or fasting lipids. And then also looking at insulin resistance or insulin sensitivity known as SI, DI, which again is disposition index, and acute insulin response. So many studies don't go into that kind of depth. So I first wanted to give you some examples of some primary prevention approaches that have been used in the literature. And some have resulted in reductions in BMI, but not all. But all of them have resulted in some improvement in behavior. Many of y'all may have heard of the CATCH program. This was actually a across the state physical activity intervention that was incorporated in all of Texas schools. And it was a coordinated approach to child health. It originally encompassed 96 schools, 56 of them were intervention, and 40 were control, and it was done in 4 states, Texas, California, Minnesota, and Louisiana. It was multiple component, and it was also a multi-year coordinated school health promotion program. And it had basically 3 targets, not just obesity, but it focused on decreasing fat, dietary fat, saturated fat, and sodium, increases in physical activity, and also focused on preventing tobacco use in children. The main outcomes paper was published over 10 years ago, and it showed that pretty much they did see reductions in dietary fat and sodium and increases in physical activity, but they saw no changes on obesity. And this was a very large-scale, expensive intervention that was done. But the CATCH did have some results, some significant results and reductions in obesity in certain areas. So in El Paso, the CATCH results, there were 4 intervention schools versus 4 controls. This was primarily Hispanic kids and encompassed 896 3rd through 5th graders. And the intervention was the CATCH curriculum, which was adapted, kind of culturally adapted for Hispanics, and money was actually given to the PE teachers to lead the physical activity component. The teachers and the staff were trained on how to use the material, and measures included observation of the PE classes, BMI percentiles, and recipes that were used in the cafeteria. The results from the El Paso CATCH program showed that kids that participated in the CATCH program did have significant improvements in vigorous physical activity, and they also saw that fat was decreased in school lunches and sodium was decreased. But unlike the full study, the El Paso CATCH did see significant reductions in obesity, and they saw them in the 4th and 5th grade. Children that participated in the CATCH program did have significantly less percent overweight and obese kids, and this was seen for both males and females. There was another intervention that was called Planet Health, and it was developed by Harvard School of Public Health. It included 4 simple health themes that were integrated into PE, language, arts, math, science, and social study classes. It was targeted towards 6th and through 8th graders, and it encouraged active inquiry-based learning. It emphasized literacy across the curriculum and addressed national learning standards. The staff was trained how to lead classroom lessons, PE curriculum, and incentives were given to teachers to make sure that they actually implemented this curriculum and taught it. The main results from Planet Health was it was a 2-year trial in 10 different public middle schools. And they actually did see a significant treatment effect for obesity, and that was seen for BMIs and reductions in triceps in girls, but not for boys. They did see significant reductions in TV viewing, and which went to 0.6 hours per day in girls and 0.4 hours per day in boys. And they saw no significant changes in moderate to vigorous activity in either boys and girls. In girls only, they saw significant improvements in fruit and vegetable intake of about 1/3 a serving a day. And in energy intake, they saw about a decrease in around 600 calories per day and a marginal effect on percent dietary fat. The changes in dietary variables were not even close to significant in the boys. There have also been several interventions that have targeted reductions in sedentary time or reductions in screen time. One randomized pilot trial with 2 schools, and it included just 192 3rd through 4th grade children. And this was one of the first interventions to target reductions in TV time. It included 18 lessons over the course of 6 months, and it was just targeting reductions in TV and media time. No other components on physical activity or dietary intake were addressed. And they did see that at 6 months, they saw significant reductions in TV time, fairly large reductions, but they saw no changes in BMI. And you can see that from the 2 graphs here. Another intervention that was conducted more recently by Epstein et al. Did a slightly different twist on the TV reduction intervention. He took 70 children and used slightly younger kids, 4 to 7 years of age, who were all close to being overweight. And he basically selected only students that watched over 14 hours a week of TV or played video games. And he randomized them into 2 groups, either control or a 50% reduction in TV time. This was a 2-year intervention, and TV time was reduced by 10% every month until the 50% reduction goal was achieved. He had kind of a cool way of doing this. He actually had the parents and the families agree to put monitoring devices on each and every TV and computer in their house. And the computer or the TV would literally shut off after the set amount of time, which forced the parents to keep to their time limits. And children were incentivized with cash if they met the monthly reduction goal. So I think this is a really cool spin on what you can do. Now here is the concert diagram, and concert diagrams are often used to show the flow of participants through intervention studies. And so they initially got 185 families were eligible, and then they randomized 70 of those families agreed to be in the study. And then out of the 70, 35 from the intervention group and 32 from the control group finished. Now, this was an interesting study because there were several parents that initially thought they'd be interested, but then when they found out that devices were going to be put on their video and TVs and computers, they were a lot less hesitant. And I will say that I know Epstein et al., and when I had talked to him about this study, and the paper also talks about this, is he was, a lot of times the parents wanted it for their children, but they didn't want it for themselves. They wanted to be able to get on the TV after they put the kids to bed. It was really interesting. It was really more driven by the parental resistance to this type of intervention. And the results did show that change in energy intake was significantly decreased in the intervention group compared to the control. And they also saw that significant decreases in sedentary behavior at hours per week was also significantly reduced. And that was really more pronounced seen at 6 months, but then maintained throughout the 2-year trial, which was really impressive. Those are big drops in sedentary time. And this study also did have significant reductions in BMI, and they were maintained over the full 2-year trial. So the intervention group had a significant change in BMI Z-score, which is oftentimes how BMI is measured, at 5, 10 months, and then was maintained at 2 years, which is pretty impressive. The authors did one additional step with the study results. Is they actually divided the population by socioeconomic status, and this I think is really telling. That the results were really driven in the reductions in obesity in the low SES group. So they saw in the low income folks, they saw significant reductions in BMI and it was maintained. But if you just look at the high income folks, you saw less, that the results were not significant. So this is really driven by income levels. Another intervention called Interactive Multimedia for Promoting Activity in Children, or IMPACT, it was developed to be an animated cartoon adventure based on social learning theory, and it was geared towards 4th and 5th grade children. Basically, 5 kids travel different parts of the country to gather ingredients for a secret antidote to the anti-activity elixir developed by an evil Schnidwit. There were 8 sessions with 2 to 3 interactive games. They used a passive learning script, and they had one good sidekick, which was a friendly, quirky guide that allowed the kids to guide them through the game. The results from this IMPACT trial showed that there were pretty much no overall changes in total physical activity, and that was measured by 7-day accelerometry. In girls, there was a small but significant increase in light intensity physical activity, and there were significant improvements in behavioral outcomes related to physical activities, including self-efficacy. The kids thought they could do it. Social norms, they thought it was cool to exercise, and outcome expectations, which it's good for me, it makes me healthy to exercise. They did see small but significant overall treatment effect of the IMPACT trial on obesity reduction in girls, but not boys. Another approach we've seen in the literature is to focus on increasing playtime, not to necessarily get the kids to per se exercise or to decrease screen time, but just make it fun and have them increase their playtime activity. One of my favorite interventions was done in Sydney, Australia, and it was called the Playground Project, and it was a randomized controlled trial of 13 weeks, and it included 12 Catholic schools. 6 were randomized to the intervention and 6 was randomized to the control. The intervention was simply that they brought in all sorts of recycled material and construction parts and basically just dumped them in the intervention school's playground. They got rid of all the other playground equipment and gym equipment. They just had this big pile of recycled materials, including barrels and PVC pipes and you name it, they had it. And they literally just let the kids creatively come up with their own games. There was no instruction. They did give an adult workshop to the different teachers there, and it was really just to train them not to interfere with children's play and just to let it happen naturally. So here are some pictures of the kids playing, and you can see they made obstacle courses with the equipment, they did races, and the researchers not only had the kids wear accelerometers to look at physical activity, but they also observed the types of games and creativity that the kids came up with to engage in more physical activity. And I do want to say that this project has not been, the final results have not been reported. This was given at the last obesity conference that I went to, and it was basically just to introduce the methods that they're doing. So I actually think that the results for this big trial will be coming out soon. Another intervention that focused on kind of this active play was the family-focused active play intervention. And it was 77 families that were recruited from 8 different child cares in England. The centers were randomly assigned to either a 10-week intervention, and this included 5 contact sessions every other week for 60 minutes. 20 minutes was just used for playtime for kids and educational lessons for the parents. And the remaining 40 minutes, teachers and parents basically engaged in active play with their child. They did games together, they did obstacle courses, they did little fun runs, and they also had self-monitoring logs to be able to write down everything that they're doing. And the other group was a control. The results from this study did show that children in the intervention group did participate and 9 less minutes of sedentary activity on weekdays and 23 less minutes on weekends. They also participated in about 5 minutes more of MVPA, or moderate vigorous physical activity, on weekdays and 10 more minutes on weekends. Mediators that this study found were parents who are more active and participated in the sports had more active children. Unfortunately, this study did not look at obesity reduction, but they did see significant improvements in kind of overall physical activity levels for the kiddos. So other physical activities have used the unconventional target that we talked about. They're really targeting changes in metabolic outcomes. And this is actually a lot of the work that I've been doing for the past 10 years, is really designing interventions, physical activity and or nutrition that target improvements in type 2 diabetes risk factors and in insulin action. Gutin et al. Was one of the first studies to show an exercise program that affected measures kind of beyond your basic BMI. It was a randomized crossover study, which means that participants either were randomized to an exercise training group or a non-exercise training group first. So they went through the exercise training group 4 months, then they had a washout period, then they went to the detraining no exercise group, or vice versa. The exercise training consisted of 5 days a week for 40 minutes a day, and included 20 minutes of cardiovascular exercise on certain equipment, certain treadmills and ellipticals, and then 20 minutes of active group games. Study included 73 obese children between 7 and 11 years of age, and the measurements included DEXA, which they used for body composition, MRI to look at different fat depots, and then they did a fasting blood sample, and they looked at glucose, insulin, and I believe insulin resistance. And this study did show significant decreases in percent body fat as measured by DEXA. And you can see here that the group 1 that was randomly assigned to the training saw reductions in percent body fat at month 4. And then the group that, and then during the control or the detraining period, they went back up. And similarly, group 2 and control, they basically stayed the same, but when they started training, they had the decrease in percent body fat. This study was also one of the first to show that an exercise program can have an effect on certain types of fat depot. And in this study, the exercise training group had less increases in visceral adipose tissue over 4 months compared to the control group, but had bigger decreases, a significant decrease in subcutaneous adipose tissue. The study also showed a significant improvement in insulin. So the group that was in the training group, the exercise group, did see reductions in insulin. And then in the detraining group, they saw increases in insulin. So it definitely improved insulin action. So the majority of the interventions I've shared with you focus on increases cardiovascular exercise. There's been a few studies recently that have used a strength training approach. In adults, this has been used pretty consistently, and strength training has been shown to improve glycemia, glucose control, insulin sensitivity, blood pressure, body composition, and decrease visceral adipose tissue in adults. Fewer studies have looked at this in youth, and the ones that have actually shown in overweight youth, children experience success because it's something they can do and they can achieve it. It also enhances program retention. Kids like to do it. It's not hard on them. They don't feel like they're failing because they can't run a mile. Instead, they're lifting. They're able to increase their strength fairly rapidly. And it also may improve body composition, and we have some data to show that. And then more recently, we see that it can improve metabolic responses, and I'm going to share with y'all some of those results. So a study that we conducted by our lab about 8 years ago was to examine the effects of a randomized controlled trial. It was 16 weeks of strength training. It was called the STEALTH study. And it was a small study. It only included 21 adolescent overweight boys, 12 to 17 years of age, and they were randomized either to the resistance training group or the controlled group, and we used a delayed intervention for this approach. They got 2 times a week for 16 weeks of strength training, and we actually outfitted one of their LA's Boys and Girls Clubs, which is like a YMCA, with a full gym equipment. and that's where we did the trainings. At pre and post measures, we used a body composition DEXA. We also did insulin sensitivity and beta cell function using the test I had mentioned to you guys at the beginning of the semester, the frequently sampled intravenous glucose tolerance test. And then we really were more interested in how this program increased strength. So we used 1 repetition maximums to look at strength increases in both their legs and their arms. So this is one of our boys that we used, and we painted basically their gym, their room. It used to be their library, and we gutted it, painted it, and then put in equipment that was donated from us from a fitness gym. This is one of our boys. As you can see, our children, even though they're teenagers, we had some really big kids. We had kids that were over 300 pounds in our program. So here are the results from the STEALTH study. We actually saw a slight decrease in percent body fat. It wasn't significant, but the resistance training group did have slightly decreases in percent body fat and slight increases in lean body mass, although not significant. But you can see that their strength increased tremendously. We had increases in bench press and in leg press. With the STEALTH study, we also saw tremendous improvements in insulin sensitivity. The kids that went through the resistance training had about a 40% increase in insulin sensitivity compared to the control, which this was one of the first studies to show that an exercise or strength training intervention could even improve insulin action. So within the resistance training group, we saw significant improvements in both upper and lower body strength. We saw slight improvements, although not significant, in body composition, increases in lean tissue mass, and decreases in percent fat. And when comparing changes in the treatment group relative to the controls, we did see that only strength increased, but this also allowed us to look at metabolic changes independent of big changes in body composition. So that's where we saw the improvements in insulin sensitivity, and that was independent of any changes in body composition. More recently, the circuit training approach has been looked at, and this is a combination of short bouts of cardiovascular activity and strength training. This was made really popular by the Curves gyms that are everywhere. Basically, they're really simple, not a whole lot of equipment. It just teaches people to do 1 to 2 minutes of cardiovascular exercises combined with 1 to 2 minutes of strength training using either your body as for plyometrics or using small weights. A similar concept is used in different programs, in different exercise gyms across the United States. CrossFit uses a similar approach where they do, bouts of cardiovascular and also bouts of strength training exercises. So this is becoming a very popular mode of exercise. Up to now, this approach has been used minimally in adults, and then even less in children. In adults, we see that cardiovascular training decreases adiposity, percent body fat, and weight. It improves fat distribution. We also see improvements in cardiovascular fitness and improvements in metabolic parameters. Whereas strength training, as I just showed you, we see tremendous increases in strength. We also see decreases in adiposity and maintenance of lean body mass. And then we see improvements in metabolic parameters as well. So the thought is combining the two, you're going to see the biggest improvements in both. The circuit training research that is out there, most have been done in adults. There were 2 studies that showed that it increased in cardiovascular fitness and increased in strength. It increased lean body mass or fat-free mass and decreased fat mass. It also had improvements in HbA1c, which is that long-term marker of glucose control. In child studies, there's only been 3 studies that have looked at the circuit training approach. 2 of them have seen increases in cardiovascular fitness. 1 has seen a decrease in abdominal fat, improvements in strength, but also improvements in lipid profiles. No study has looked at the effects of circuit training on insulin dynamics until recently, and I'm going to share with you my pilot study. And also, no one really looks at the acceptability is not as actively reported. This is an important factor because this really speaks to if they're going to be able to maintain the program after the research is done. And I always think of it as, if you have an obese person that's 300 or 400 pounds, expecting them to go out and run a mile or 2 is probably unrealistic. But you can start them And it's feasible to start them with 10 minutes of cardiovascular, have them stop, and then have them do 2-3 minutes of strength training, and then back to the cardiovascular exercise. So by the end of an hour or 90 minutes, they've gotten 30 to 45 minutes of cardiovascular in an attainable fashion. So I'm going to show you a couple specific studies that have been done on the circuit training approach. This one was done with 48 overweight adults, and it was 24 months. And they were randomized to one of 3 groups for 16 weeks. So the intervention was 16 weeks, but the trial was conducted over 2 years. They were randomized to either an aerobic training group, a circuit training group, or a strength training group. And the measurements included body composition using the DEXA, cardiovascular fitness using the VO2 max that we talked about, and muscular strength using the 1 repetition maximum, the bench and shoulder press. So here are the results from that circuit training intervention. And the top figure shows improvements in strength and fitness. And the aerobic training group actually had slight decreases in bench press and a very small but not significant increase in shoulder press and a big increase in fitness. And that's what you would expect. The strength training group, which is the ST group, had significant improvements in both bench press and shoulder press, but small decreases, and they weren't significant in the fitness group. Whereas the circuit training group or the CT group had improvements in all 3. So it really seems to be the best type of exercise to really improve fitness, cardiovascular output, as well as strength. And if you look at the changes in weight on the bottom figure, you can see that the aerobic training and circuit training actually resulted in very similar weight loss, whereas the strength training, we didn't really see a big decrease in weight, and we saw a small decrease in body fat, whereas both the aerobic training and circuit training, we saw decreases in both body weight and body fat. So this brings us to my study, and it was called ACT-LA, and it stood for Adolescent Circuit Training in Los Angeles. And the top picture is a picture of my girls. This was just for overweight Latino girls, and there were 45 that were in the study. And they were randomized to one of 3 groups. And we tested the control. We used a similar approach as we've done in other studies, which was a delayed circuit training intervention. And what that means is the girls that were assigned to control group just had to wait until their post measures, and then they got the same intervention. So that also impacts, a lot of kids, when you're doing an obesity intervention, they want to be in it because they're ready to lose weight. So the kids that get in the control group might feel bad or might drop out of the program unless you give them incentive to stay in the program. But the other 2 groups were circuit training, and they got strength plus aerobic training 2 times a week per week. And we had a gym at our lab at USC, and it was full. It had a demonstration kitchen for any nutrition interventions that were led, and it had a full gym, cardiovascular equipment, weight training, free weights, and stations that we developed that the kids would come to. And I hired personal trainers, and they would train the girls twice a week. And each class was around 90 minutes, so they got a pretty good workout. The last group was a circuit training, the same exact circuit training program, except we included weekly motivational interviewing sessions. And these were basically behavioral therapy sessions that they would meet with our staff, and we talk about goal setting. And here's some pictures of the circuit training happening. And many times we had, 8 to 10 kids per class. So it was really busy. It wasn't a huge gym. And so pretty much at any given time, one of the girls was on one piece of equipment. And we broke it into where they got into groups of 3 or 4. And so 3 or 4 girls would start on the cardiovascular equipment, and after 2 minutes, our instructors would blow a whistle, and they would move to the strength training equipment, and then switch back to the same cardiovascular, and they would do this pretty much for the full 90 minutes. Kids were really sweating. It was a very good workout. Now here's that consort diagram that I've talked to you about before. This is really just to outline the flow of participants to the study. And even though we ended with 45 kids, in order to get this number, you have to start with a pretty big number. And so we screened and recruited over 200 kids. And then by the time we consented them and got them to enroll in the program, several of them dropped out during the measurement test, and then several more dropped out during the actual intervention. And these are kids that go to school, so things happen. They get busy with school. band practice or homework, and so it's really hard to keep kids in a program for 4 months. So here's the baseline descriptors for this study, and I just wanted to point out these because I wanted to make sure you guys realize that these were really big, unhealthy kiddos. They were extremely obese right up at the top, so they were not, all around above 97th percentile, and all of them were above 40% body fat. So these were big kiddos, and also fairly had a high amount of visceral fat, and we also saw a lot of them had a high amount of liver fat. So here are the results and the outcomes. And the first graph looks at VO2 max, and we used a VO2 max on the treadmill test. And we did see the CT plus MI group, which is circuit training plus motivational interviewing, and versus the CT versus the control group. We actually saw that both the CT and CT plus MI group had significant improvements in VO2 max compared to the control. And the blue bar represents baseline, and the green bar represents week 16 post-intervention. So you saw that in both intervention groups, we had an increase in VO2 max, and that actually declined in the control group, which is what we hypothesized. And similarly, we had big increases in strength. We did see that the intervention group, we saw about a 40% increase in strength versus about a 20% increase in control. So the control kids actually did get stronger, but the intervention groups got significantly more stronger. And that was seen for both the leg press and the bench press. So we also saw significant improvements in adiposity. And the top graph is changes in waist. But surprisingly, the significant changes were really between the circuit training group and the control group. And so we did see a slight yet significant decrease in waist circumference in the circuit training group compared to the control. And we also saw a significant decrease in the subcutaneous adipose tissue and the visceral adipose tissue compared to control. But again, this did not reach significant in the CT plus MI group. It was just between the CT and the control groups. We also looked at insulin action with this study, and we did see that, again, the results, the significant improvements were between the circuit training and the control group. So the circuit training group had significant decreases in insulin and insulin resistance, and that was measured by the HOMA-IR, whereas the control group had slight increases in insulin and not significant changes in insulin resistance. And we were wondering, we didn't know why we kept seeing these improvements in circuit training, but not necessarily the circuit training plus MI. We haven't analyzed the secondary analysis yet, but one thought is the kids that were receiving this motivational interviewing behavioral treatment, at first it seemed really successful and effective, but after about the 4th time that we were meeting with them, and we met with them probably 10 times throughout the program, they kind of were over it. They didn't really want to talk about their feelings anymore. And so it's almost like a forced behavioral therapy that wasn't effective. So we kept to what the protocol said, that we were going to do 10 sessions, but I think really 2 or 3 sessions would have been much more effective. So in summary, I've shared with you many different types of exercise, physical activity interventions that have targeted both adults and kids. And there are several that showed focusing on reducing sedentary time or decreasing screen time can have beneficial effects on reducing obesity. The studies that have actually targeted increases in playtime, they do seem to increase physical activity, but it's really unclear on how they affect obesity. Strength training can have a more positive effect on metabolic health, and it does seem to have some effect, yet small, on body composition. And circuit training, which is the combined effect, may be an optimal starter program, gets kids to increase their strength and their fitness, as well as reduce obesity and metabolic outcomes. So it really is a matter on what you choose and what outcomes you're hoping to focus on.